Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to this podcast on Europe at a time of war. My name is Nico Heller, and this is Reboot 2030, a Democracy School podcast. My guest today is Roberto Castaldi. Roberto is a European federalist. He holds a PhD in international relations in the area of European integration and is an associate professor of political philosophy at eCampus University in Italy. He's also the CEO of the International Center for European and Global Governance, co-edits Perspective on Federalism, and is the general editor of Euractiv Italy. I can see that Roberto is already here, so let me invite him in. Roberto, I already briefly introduced you. Thank you very much for connecting with me here today and to catch up on the state of Europe. Europe at a time of war. This is a kind of a difficult time for a lot of people across Europe, specifically, especially, of course, Eastern Europe and the Ukraine and all that is happening there. But we'll come to that later. Roberto, what we're seeing now is that Europe is facing, possibly for the first time in its history, multiple serious threats. Internally, via right wing and populist nationalists, and externally because of the ongoing war in Ukraine and other geopolitical risks. I mean, for example, China and so on and so forth around the world. In addition, global warming and migration act within Europe as a fuel. It really further massively exaggerates these divisions along nationalist or populist versus liberal versus federalist lines. And it, at the moment, really looks increasingly like the populists and nationalists are gaining the upper hand. Not really only at the sort of a member state level, but also at the European level. And there are European elections coming up before long. So this really is something to look into. I mean, you've been following these developments closely. Should we be concerned? And how significant are these developments? How will they play out if current trends persist? Over to you.
Well, of course, we need to be worried, but in an active sense. It's up to us. European citizens can decide the way that Europe goes through this European election. And I think that we should not underestimate the fact that the geopolitical challenges and the domestic challenges go hand in hand. Because on the one hand, the geopolitical challenges show that the member states are unable to guarantee the security of the citizens. In the European Union member states together spend for defense basically almost as much as China, more than about three times as much as Russia before the war. Now, of course, Russia has increased dramatically its military expenditure, but the 27 together spend still more than about twice as much as Russia, and we have no deterrent capacity. If we had, Russia would not have invaded Ukraine. So we spend about 35% of the US with a capacity of 10%. Why? Because we have 27 useless national militaries rather than having one European defense. This is what an example of what we usually call the costs of non-Europe. Non-Europe is very expensive. Non-Europe is very expensive. There is a report that was coming out last month by the Research Center of the European Parliament about the costs of non-Europe, which is about 6,700 euro per year per European citizen. So if we had a European defense, if we had a European health policy like we did for the vaccines with the pandemic, if we had a European single market, a single capital market, if we had a European fiscal policy avoiding fiscal competition among member states, if we had a truly united and federal Europe, this would save us more than 3,000 billion euros, because the calculation was. So 6,700 euro per European citizen. This is huge. So if the pro-European parties were willing and able and brave enough to campaign on this, I'm sure that the results of the election would be more favorable for the pro-European parties than for nationalists, because nobody can be so stupid to be willing to keep national sovereignty in fields where this national sovereignty is simply useless in order to spend more money and gets less public goods. So this is the issue. And I think that this is linked together, the geopolitical challenges, because the Europeans today are praying. So there is a war in Europe, in Ukraine for 2 years. And in these 2 years, we have been unable to do anything to stop the war. Not only to prevent the war, but to stop the war. We have been hoping that the US or China or Turkey or the Pope or whoever is passing by can make a proposal, a mediation or something, like if we were not an actor, because we are not an actor. Because we don't have a single foreign policy, but no member state is an actor that can make a mediation. So we are looking for somebody else to do something on a war that is in Europe. And the same is happening in Palestine and the Middle East. Europe is the largest trade partner for Israel and is the largest donor for the Palestine Authority. So we should have the leverage to do something, to mediate, to make some proposal, but we are unable to do anything at all. Why? Because we don't have a single foreign policy. We don't have a single defense policy. We don't have a European defense. So we are basically spectators of what happens in our doorstep, in our neighborhood. And still people think that, well, you know, but national defense is a crucial aspect of national sovereignty. There are polls that have come out in the recent months that show that 70% of the European citizens are in favor of a European defense. And there was, but the Eurobarometer.
Let me stop here for 1 second. We're going to come to those points a bit later on in the conversation.
Yes,
detail. I would like to
just an example because of the linkage between the geopolitics. Then we'll go on the defense more specifically. But the linkage with this with the election is important because the issue is that people are afraid of what is going on the geopolitical level and on the other level. When we see the agricultural protest today and the backlash against the Green Deal and the ecological transition and so on. I mean, on the one hand, we had the young people protesting because nothing was done against climate change, and now we have the agriculture that are protesting because they also need to change the way they produce food if we want to have a net zero by 2050. So the issue is, if this is approached at national level, what happens? That each national government just goes and asks the union, please protect our farmers because otherwise we lose the elections. Well, if we look at it at European level, the agricultural policy has to fit in what we do within the Green Deal. And of course, you need to accompany this transition with funding. Of course we do. But the issue is that this funding cannot be considered just as a subsidy. I mean, when we do industrial policy is about promoting investment. The same thing is for agricultural policy. If 30% of the European Union budget is the agricultural policy. I mean, if we spend that much money on agricultural policy, this needs to be incentivizing investment for agriculture to become greener. I mean, there is nothing wrong with that. So the issue is that if we are able to frame the issue in a European frame, then everything becomes understandable why we are doing this or something else and how to approach this. And the other element is fear. People are afraid of change. This is normal. But the issue is that the public policy need to reassure people that this change will not have bad consequences for them, because all changes always has a trade-off. There are always some winners and some losers, some good effect and some cost in a transition, even to a better situation. So you need to help people to cover those costs in order to reap the benefits of that transition. And this is how to frame the Green Deal, the industrial policy, and so on. So the point is that we have a narrative of fear by the nationalists and populists, and we have a narrative of hope, of future designing. So Europe is the level of government where we can design a better society, our future altogether. While the nationalists can only propose us to go back to a national sovereignty that is completely useless in the 21st century. And everybody realized that what state alone can solve climate change? Of course, none. Even Europe is small from that perspective. So we have chances. And also we have the linkage between the external aspect and internal aspect in the fact that very often the nationalist parties are linked, financed, and helped by external actors. I mean, when there are parties that have a cooperation agreement with Putin's party, like the League in Italy, or who had got financing from Russian banks like Le Pen, Rassemblement National, and so on, it's clear that there is a linkage between certain nationalist group and some external actors like Russia, or in other countries, China, or the US. We shall not forget that Bannon came to Europe trying to create the international of the nationalists, of the populist parties, and so on, to try and erode this bad liberal democracy and the European Union, which shall collapse because it's a potential alternative to the US on the one hand, and because it's the protector of liberal democracy in the member states, with this conditionality and so on, blocking funding for member states that destroy the rule of law. Now, the European Commission is unblocking 137 billion euro for Poland because the new government is dismantling the reform of the judiciary of the previous government that destroyed the judicial independence in Poland. So this shows how big was the effect of the European Union blocking this funding. I mean, 137 billion euro is huge. If
Absolutely.
we think that
let me just come in here for a moment. You're absolutely right. There's kind of two. In fact, there's more than two. But that you can sort of reduce it to two sort of, if you like, narratives. A sort of a narrative that is sort of on the sort of on the liberal centrist federalist side, and a narrative that is on the populist, nationalist, and indeed on the fascist side as well. Because obviously those currents exist too. Now, we have these European elections come up. And when you look at the kind of the protests by farmers and so, you will see that a lot of, like not just farmers, but a lot of the kind of haulage, the kind of the truck drivers, the lorries, basically a lot of, if you like, stakeholders that really have to go through fundamental change. In order to, somehow meet or get closer to the kind of climate targets that we've set ourselves, they have aligned themselves, or the far right has aligned itself with those people, and there's a kind of a very, very toxic alliance building up, which is kind of sort of, if you like, a sort of an anti-green fascist kind of alliance, which makes it very, very difficult for sort of like sort of green campaigners, green parties around Europe, and anybody with a green agenda. You mentioned the sort of the Green Deal that's been totally destroyed at the European level, and now so you have that, and you have the elections coming up now. What we might see in the next 6 months is a total, like a very, very different Europe, a very different composition of the European Parliament. It is not beyond possibility that the kind of the right-wing forces will dominate a future European Parliament. I mean, we look at Italy, look at Poland, look at Hungary, look at Germany.
This is very unlikely.
Germany is massively on the rise. Look at Sweden,
yes.
Look at Finland, look at France, look at Spain. You can go on. I mean, the far right parties are on the rise, and there is and a lot of them have a well, certainly Europe critical, and many of them an anti-European agenda and aim for sort of a League of Nations, to replace the European Union.
Absolutely, absolutely. But that's the point that the polls of polls suggest that even if they are on the rise, they won't get a majority in the European Parliament. And the other aspect is that the issue is if the pro-European parties will be willing to take those arguments head on. Because people want to destroy the European Union, to go back to national sovereignty and so on. And if the pro-European parties were willing and able to do the campaign on this and not on other issue, they would win. Because after Brexit, we had Brexit. Brexit is the greatest political, economic, and social disaster of the 21st century.
Well, not everybody in the UK sees it this way. This is really fascinating. I mean, it
Yes.
is actually still fairly stable. Yes, the kind of it's sort of slightly changed, and there's more people now thinking it has been a failure, but it's not been a drastic shift.
But there was a reason that in politics, concomitancy is very important. The huge economic damage of Brexit was initially hidden by the pandemic because it happened at the same time. So everybody had a dramatic economic slump because of the pandemic. The issue is that after the pandemic, the other recovered and the UK did not, because the UK had Brexit and the other did not. So now people start realizing that, well, maybe this is actually Brexit and it was not just the pandemic. So now there is an increasing strong public opinion that realized that Brexit was a failure. But around Europe, people realized this very quickly. I mean, we can remember the images of a supermarket in the UK without vegetables and without medicines and so on because of Brexit. I mean, who wants to live in a country where you can get, it's difficult to get veggies or medicines because they have cut out their own chain of supply. So this was beside all the other impact on inflation, on public finances, on economic growth, on foreign investment, and so on. So Brexit was a disaster, and I think that everybody in Europe realized that. So even the nationalists that before used to call for their country to get out of the European Union, like Le Pen was for Frexit and Salvini and Meloni were for Italexit and so on, nobody today speaks about quitting the European Union because everybody realized that without the European Union, they are done. And citizens had this clear in mind after the pandemic. But what would have happened if it was not for the European Union? We would have had many less vaccines at a much higher prices because each European country would bid against the other with the big pharma to get the vaccines. While the fact that we had centralized the buying of the vaccines at European level has ensured that we were not having a competition between the richest European country and the poorer European countries, that everybody would receive the vaccine at the same time, if they were poor or if they were rich, whatever country they were, and so on. So we got the vaccine quicker, in a massive supply, at a lower cost, and in a fairer way. And all this was due to the European Union. And citizens realized that what would have happened to the, let's say, I'm Italian, what would have happened to Italy, that was the country worst hit by the pandemic, if it was not for the Next Generation EU and the recovery plan? 200 billion euro provided to Italy in 4 years to recover from the pandemic slump. This was huge. So people today realize much more than in 2019, because the previous election were in 2019, that the European Union is crucial. The issue is that all these challenges, all these crises make people afraid, and they look for comfort, they look for security. And the pro-European have not been willing, able, and brave to go out and campaign to say, we need to complete European integration if you want to get protection. if you want a Europe that really protects you, and not just with the vaccines and next generation EU, but also with the green transition, the digital transition, the European defense, and so on, we need to give Europe the means, the power, the competency to do that. I think that if the pro-European go and campaign on this, they win. Because it's true that people are afraid, but are not stupid. They are afraid for good reason, that they see that we don't count anything on the global scene confronted with this crisis. At the same time, the only one that make a proposal to defend them, even if in a stupid way, are the nationalists. They say, we'll close the border, no migrants anymore, we'll keep the war at bay outside our borders, and so on and so forth. This is nonsense, of course. I mean, Italy is the best example. We have now a very right-wing government. In the first year of this government, we had more than twice as many migrants as before. So this tells us everything about how stupid their policy proposal about migration were. They said, vote us and we'll close the border, no migrants anymore. We have more than double numbers.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting about it. Actually, the same. I don't know whether to the same extent, but in the UK too, migration went up after Brexit. But that's an interesting point. But I think there's a danger in kind of always sort of saying, well, to look at this kind of binary alternatives in Europe or no Europe, because I think what is a far more problematic situation is that we're in Europe, but that Europe stops functioning entirely. For a whole host of reasons, if we have a very strong, possibly even a dominant nationalist bloc within the European Parliament, it's going to be very difficult to pass any legislation at a European level. So that's one thing. So there is this whole issue about dysfunctionality that will go up and will add to the problems and play into the hands of populists who will even more be able to say, you see, nothing happens, it doesn't work. And they'll be able to undermine and at the same time criticize that it doesn't work. So I think that is one thing that we have to be quite aware of. The other thing is, let me just to add this, the other thing is that so far the EU has, for all its flaws, been a very positive force in terms of employment rights, environmental standards, consumer protection, you name it, anything from mobility to healthcare to this, that, and the other. Now, if you have a right-wing majority in the European Parliament, this could flip. So rather than Europe being that positive influence that we all know, it could become quite the opposite. It could drive climate change. It could basically liberate industry so that workers across Europe have less rights. It could force countries that are protecting their workers to stop doing so. So there is this potential for Europe to turn in on itself, quite apart from the risk of dysfunctionality. Maybe you can say a little bit about those two and how you see that develop and where you see the risks and challenges.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that there will be a right-wing majority in the European Parliament because the polls at European level suggest this is not the case. So I think that we will have again a majority between the EPP, the center-right, the Liberal, and the of Renew Europe, and the Socialists and Democrats, and possibly the Greens with them. So these will probably remain the majority of the European Parliament. At the same time, I think that the issue is it's up to the European citizens to decide with their votes what kind of European policies they want. So it is perfectly fair to have a center-left or a center-right majority at the European level, and on the basis of that majority, you will have more left-wing or more right-wing policies at the European level. The issue is that it's important that remains the cordon sanitaire, the limit to the fact that nobody is allowed into the European majority if they are against European integration itself. Because, you can always find a compromise on a policy, find a balance regarding the different policies, right or left, if you agree that that policy needs to be done at European level. What you cannot find an agreement and a compromise is when you think that this policy should be dealt with at European level with somebody that thinks that no, this should be dealt at national level only. Because there is no possible compromise at that point on the kind of policy to be done. So I think that we are going towards a situation where part of the right wing will have to decide if they want to be influential on the European policies or if they want to remain nationalists. A party like Meloni, Fratelli d'Italia, for example, those right-wing parties that are in government. And once you are in government, you need to try to solve problems. You cannot just do propaganda. So they realize that they cannot solve problems at national level, that they need to do certain things at European level. Meloni used to be against European Union, asking sovereignty back and so on. Now that she's the head of the government, she's asking for the European Union to do more on anything, to do more on migration, to do more on defense, to do more on foreign policy. Why? Because she's in government and she realized that she cannot do it. So it's better if the European Union does it. So this kind of parties, so she has a rhetoric and a propaganda against the EU, but then at the same time, she's asking you to do more all the time. So these parties will have to decide if they leave aside their nationalism, they change their position on Europe, at that point, they can join the European majority and will be able to move further to the right, the compromise, the balance of the European policies on any issue. While if they stick to the ideological position that they are for national sovereignty, they don't want European sovereignty on migration, on fiscal policy, on foreign defense policy, they will remain out of the European majority and they will not be able to influence the policies of the European Union. So they have a trade-off there. And I think that what is likely is that we may find a split in the right-wing parties during this legislature. So they go together now because it's important to have a European family and to pretend that they will be strong, will become an important group that will be relevant and impactful and so on. But at the end of the day, they will realize that if that group keeps a nationalist position, they won't be able to influence any policy. At that point, some of them may decide that we better serve even our national interest by taking a pro-European stand and influencing European policy than maintaining a nationalist one and being unable to influence European policy. Because they may like it or not, but the most important policy decisions are taken at European level. This is the contradiction of today's world in Europe, that the policies are decided mainly at European level, but the political competition is mainly run at national level. So citizens basically look at what national parties say, but what matters is what they decide actually at European level. I mean, the Green Deal, which influence all kinds of policies, from heating to transport to agriculture to industrial policy, this is decided at European level, not at national level. When we think about the CHIPS Act, the Artificial Intelligence Act, all these kind of things that are regulating the future, all of this is not done at national level. It is done at European level only. So I think that we are today in a situation that people can realize that what happens at European level is very impactful, provided that the pro-European parties are willing and able to campaign on that and to campaign on the success of the European Union. I mean, in this legislature, 2019-2024, the European Union did the vaccines, the next generation EU with the first common debt for the first time, the European Central Bank poured over 2 trillion euro to save member states during the pandemic and finance their efforts. So, I mean, we have seen, and the European Union was able to answer the Russian invasion to Ukraine with a number of 13 now packages of sanction and military help and so on. So without the European Union, would we be better off? I think that this legislature proved very well that we would be worse off without the European Union. The issue is if the European parties, the socialists, the liberals, the Christian Democrats, are they gonna fight are they going to campaign for Europe? Because it looks that while the nationalists are happy to campaign against Europe, they play on the attack. The pro-European play defense only. They are saying, oh, but it's not that bad. I mean, nobody can be convinced by saying that something is not that bad. You need to show why it's good and how can be better. And that's the challenge for the pro-European parties, that we should challenge them every day. Tell us the truth about the cost of Europe, about what European Union did this legislature, about what we could do if we were more united on fiscal policy, on the defense, and so on and so forth, on energy. And energy is the best example for certain aspects, because we had a big energy crisis. And now that the prices have come down a little bit, this has come out of the public view. But in Europe, we pay energy 2 to 3 times as much as China and the US, which are our main competitor. Our industry, our economy will not prosper long if we pay energy, which is essential for all production, for all transport and so on, 2 to 3 times as much as China and the US. So we are done. But if we had a single European energy grid, the price would go down 32%, according to a study of the University College of Dublin. 32% only if we had the European energy grid, because we would be allowed to exploit wind energy from the north in winter and solar energy from the south in the summer and so on. And by being able to move the energy throughout Europe where it's produced and so on, we would be able to have more energy at a cheaper price and a reduction overall of 32%. If we had a European strategic reserve like the US, if we buy the energy, we are the largest energy importer in the world. I mean, when there was the invasion of Ukraine, we had a terrible spectacle. We could see all the foreign ministers of each European country going to the same African countries to negotiate new deals to import more energy. And these countries were so happy because they could make the price. Because if you don't sign this price today, Italy, okay, tomorrow we'll give it to Spain or to Germany. So they make the price. But when we think about gas doesn't move without the pipeline. I mean, you need to have the pipeline. The pipeline from Africa go to Europe. So you can send it to Italy or Spain or Germany, but only to the European Union, because that pipeline comes here. So if we had sent just the European Commissioner for Energy and say, look, we'll buy all this energy, but at this price, otherwise we don't buy it, I mean, we would make the price, and we will not be forced to pay 2 to 3 times as much as China and the US. So we could do so many things that benefits the European citizen if we only were united. It's amazing. But the issue is that the political parties are not campaigning on the offensive, showing what we could do if we were united. And we can see it when we are, because what we did for the vaccines, we could do it for the energy, we could do it for the military equipment, and so on and so forth. So we have plenty of areas of policies where, by being divided, we continue to spend a huge amount of money for nothing, while we could have much less expenditure for much better public goods if we were united. So this is something that everybody can understand very easily. And with this report by the European Parliament, it provides ammunition for the pro-European parties if they are willing to use them.
I think, Roberto, the line of argument you're taking is really viable. It's as you said, a narrative of hope versus a narrative of fear. And I think this is really, in terms of the upcoming European election, that is absolutely key. I'm sort of, well, we'll see whether that works, because of course when I look back at the UK, and there was a sort of they actually had it the other way around almost. There was this sort of narrative of hope among Brexiteers, and there was this narrative of fear of the pro-Europeans, all the bad stuff that would happen if you leave the EU. Of course, much of that actually has happened and worse, but of course it was fear versus hope, except the other way around in the case of Brexit. Now, what's interesting is I mean, when I look at Germany and when I look at the kind of arguments that have been put forward at a local, at a regional, and at a national level, the technocratic arguments, the kind of economic arguments, the kind of empirical arguments don't really seem to catch fire. What does catch fire is a sort of a much more identitarian narrative, a very different kind of narrative that seems to be much easier for people to relate to identify with. Now, I hope that the narrative of hope that you're sort of sketching out here will catch on and will lead in the European elections. But when I look at, for example, at Poland or at Hungary, it's quite worrying how quickly even a democracy can be turned into a quasi-authoritarian system. When you look at the US, what might happen there if Trump gets reelected, and how that might restructure the US towards an authoritarian system. I wonder, would such a thing be, in your view, be possible at a European level? I mean, this is a kind of a thing, if you're right, and if the far right kind of populists remain a minority, it's all for nothing. We're lucky. We're kind of plain sailing. But if that isn't the case, if we're back in 1928, and not in 1928 Germany, mind you, but in 1928 Europe, where you also had Franco and you had Mussolini and you had Hitler and then you had, so it was not just a German thing. And again, now it's not just a German, or Italian or whatever, or Polish or Hungarian. It's a in fact, a global sort of current that is kind of sweeping across Europe. And if that current has that sort of the tailwinds that it seems to have, how dangerous could that be for the European project?
Very dangerous, of course. But I would like to take a different comparison. And this comparison is India. India is a strange country in the sense that it was created as a democracy by the Mahatma Gandhi, and it was one of the poorest country of the world. And most of the poorest country of the world, one way or another, had an authoritarian turn. Because when you have millions of people that die by starvation every year, it's very difficult that they will accept that they keep a democratic government in place. But India did. And why did India remain democratic even if it was so poor and with so millions of people starving every year? And the reason was that it was a federal system. Because to change India, to make an authoritarian turn in India, you would need not only to get control of the federal government, but also of the state government, which is very difficult. And I think that from that perspective, the European Union, being still not a fully fledged federal system, but a partially federal system because it's a multi-level system of government, is our best insurance against authoritarian turn. Because on the one hand, it's when you have an authoritarian party that gets the upper hand at national level, you will see the European Union trying to make resistance. Like you had peace taking away the judicial independence, and you had the European Union blocking 137 billion euro funding, which probably played a role in having the opposition winning the election last autumn in Poland. So it's difficult. The European Union makes it more difficult to have authoritarian turn into the member states. At the same time, it's difficult to have an authoritarian turn at the European level because to change the rules at the European level, you need the consent of the member states. And the other member states where there aren't authoritarian forces in government would not accept to reduce the liberties, the freedom, the rule of law at the European level. Furthermore, it's very difficult for the nationalists to agree on anything. They have a negative agenda. They agree in saying no to this, no, not to that, no to Europe, no to migrants, no to vaccines, no to something else, no to the Green Deal. But when you try to see what is their agenda, their positive agenda, what kind of policies they want, they have none. The best example is Identity and Democracy group in the European Parliament. Now there are the European election and they don't have a manifesto for the election. Why? Because their manifesto is, and their statute says that each member party, each national party votes the way they like. And the responsibility of the whip is only to ensure that each delegation, national delegation, votes as their national party says. So even if they vote each against the others, well, that's fine. I mean, so they in their own statute, they recognize that they don't have an agenda. They cannot make any policy. So why should a reasonable person vote for somebody who doesn't have an agenda? You don't know what they want. You only know what they don't want. They don't want migrants. They don't want Europe. They don't want the Green Deal. So they don't want to deal with climate change, which will kill your children and grandchildren. Is this what you want? They don't want migrants, but their policy to prevent migrants are a failure. Once they go to government, migrants are twice as much as before. They don't want a European sovereignty, but with your national sovereignty, Putin will invade Ukraine and maybe afterward other countries. Because if we were acting alone, nobody would be able to help Ukraine and we would be done in a short time. So their agenda is completely nonsense. So I think that from that perspective, also what you said about fear and hope is very relevant. Because in the UK, hope won. It was a wrong hope because the Brexiteers were lying.
Yeah.
When they said with outside Europe, we would have 150 billions per week for the NHS. It was a
350
lie.
million it was, but yes, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it was a lie. And in fact, today the NHS is in the worst situation ever. And there is so much discussion in the UK how it's possible that the national health system is so bad. No, because it was a lie. So it was a lie, but it was framed as hope, while the remainder were based on the status quo is not so bad. So my issue is precisely the same. On the one hand, you are those that are running over fear, but the others are not running on hope. They are not presenting a strong project. That's what they should do. If they do, the pro-European will win, because the pro-European project is in the interest of everybody in Europe. I mean, you have to, and this is also about identity politics, the other crucial element you mentioned. A great British historian, Arnold Toynbee, suggested that the Europeans today are like the Greek of the polis, of the Hellenic civilization, and the Italians of the Renaissance, divided among many small city-states, Florence and Rome and Venice and so on and so forth. These two great civilizations had a simple choice: unite or perish. And both of them died, because the Greek were told by Aristotle that the polis was the natural venue of the political, economic, and cultural life. So compared to the Macedonian and then Roman Empire, they didn't manage to unite and they were conquered. The Italian of the Renaissance, the same thing. Compared to the first modern state, France, Spain, they had a simple choice, but they thought that Europe, Italy was a geographic expression, just like Metternich said a few centuries afterwards. So they didn't unite. And even if the Hellenic civilization was the top at the time, and the Renaissance civilization was the top in Europe at the time, both of them collapsed because they didn't unite. Today, we are in the same situation. In the global world today, only continent-wide states have the resources to maintain their competitiveness, their security, to invest, to maintain a role. So there is the US, there is China, there will soon be India. we have to decide if we want to remain an actor in the world or to be the field of the competition for the other actors. So Europe has to decide, do we want to be the pitch or do we want to be one of the team that plays in the tournament?
I think this is a very good point to kind of move on to my last two questions. And we started off with that, and I was sort of trying to kind of pull you back a bit, but I want to come back to that. And the first one really has to do with sort of eastward expansion of the European Union. I mean, obviously, Ukraine really is desperate to join the European fold. Moldovia would like to join Europe as well. And what kind of there have been accession agreements with both of those countries now, and we know how this can go. We, look at Turkey. I mean, but at the same time, the ambition is there, and the situation is very, very different from Turkey because of the threat with Russia and all the rest. How do you judge? I mean, what is your assessment of that kind of expansion and potential sort of integration of those countries into the European Union? Do you think that's a realistic and kind of a desirable even ambition, or is this just kind of, a pipe dream?
We don't know yet. The truth is that it's very difficult for those countries to join the EU, especially if there is the war there and Russian troops on their territories, because this is the case for both of them. Everybody remembers the war in Ukraine, but also in Moldavia, there is a region that is occupied by Russian troops. So that's the first issue. The other aspect is that the European Union needs to reform itself to be able to accommodate new countries. Because we can see already that the European Union doesn't work well because of unanimity. We have unanimity on foreign policy, on security policy, on defense policy, on fiscal policy, on the budget, on sanctions, on all these most important things we decide by unanimity. We don't manage to get unanimity with 27. And very often we don't get it because countries are using their veto just to get some compensation on a completely different dossier that doesn't have anything to do with it. So unanimity doesn't work. We need to get rid of unanimity before we let anybody in. So we need to reform the treaties. And the European Parliament made a proposal to reform the treaties. Last November was approved by the plenary. And now the European Council is supposed legally to decide if to examine those proposals by calling a European Convention to reform the treaties. So that's the big issue. And of course, let's make a mind game, a mind experiment. Let's think for a second that today Ukraine was a member state of the European Union with the current rules. Now, Ukraine, for good reason, I mean, let's say the war is finished. We don't know how, it doesn't matter. But the war is finished in Ukraine. Ukraine is a member of the European Union, which is with the existing rules. Now, basically, any Ukrainian would have had somebody in his or her family killed or wounded or something else because of the war. Anybody in his or her family will have a killed or wounded or something or having fled, exiled, whatever from Ukraine. So in that country, to get any form of cooperation with Russia would be unacceptable. For good reason. At the same time, for Europe as a whole, Russia is our neighbor. If the war is finished, we'll need to find some form of security organization in Europe. We cannot just have an enemy at our doorstep without creating any cooperation agreement, any security agreement, anything at all. So Europe would have the need to establish some form of relationship with Russia, and Ukraine would put a veto on anything in order to have its way on the only things that matters, that is not to have any form of cooperation with Russia. Because any Ukrainian government that accepts to have any form of cooperation with Russia will lose the election. So this is a mind experiment, but it's very easy. Everybody can understand what unanimity would do if we were to enlarge now. it would completely paralyze the European Union. So is enlargement to Ukraine and Moldavia desirable? Of course it is, in the sense that if those countries want to join the European Union and are democracies, why shouldn't they be allowed to join the European Union? At the same time, the European Union needs to be prepared for the enlargement by getting rid of unanimity in the whole decision-making system. Because otherwise the enlargement risks to be just the start of the destroy of the Union.
Can I just at this point go back once more very briefly to an earlier point in our discussion, which I thought was a really interesting one. And you sort of said our best defense against a sort of a shift into authoritarianism is the fragmentation and the the kind of the fact that the EU isn't yet a fully integrated federation. Now, unanimity would actually bring us a significant step closer to that. I give you, just to make this point. I mean, for many years I've been on and off been active in the kind of the refugee or no borders movement and so on and so forth. And the Geneva Convention on refugee convention is very imperfect because it's a very narrowly drafted convention to protect refugees, and the definition of refugees is very narrow. For example, it excludes any form of climate induced migration and so on and so forth. So there's been a sort of a lively debate whether the kind of the refugee convention from 1951 needs reforming. But there is a consensus that if we would open this convention up now, it would actually get watered down. It would be worse than what we had before because of the way people feel about refugees and migration at the moment. So everybody's saying, well, don't touch it. Now, I wonder, with the European Union, given the kind of, the forces at play at the moment, isn't there a similar argument one could make and say, don't touch it? If we integrate any further, we're just basically handing power to the nationalists and to the, the kind of authoritarian.
Well, I think that people don't trust democracy enough. The European citizens had the chance to express themselves with the Conference on the Future of Europe. And the proposal they made out of the Conference on the Future of Europe was to strengthen the European Union, to give it more powers, more competency, to streamline the decision-making, to get rid of unanimity. So I think that if there was a reform and was the issue of the reform is how you ratify it. If you make a good reform and then you want national ratification, you are creating incentive to kill it. Because if you ratify, nothing changes. You do what the governments have decided. While if you kill it, everybody will come and ask you what you want in order to ratify or whatever. So I think that the issue is that we need a reform that institute a European referendum, like the Conference on the Future of Europe proposed, and that European referendum is used to ratify the new treaty. That referendum should be with double majority. You need a European majority, but also a national majority in a majority of member states, in order to recognize the fact that the Union is a federal system that is a union of citizens and of states. So you need a double majority, both of citizens and of states. Of course, if you get both, the treaty is ratified. It means that you may still have some countries where there was a national majority against ratification. In those countries, they should vote again within 6 months to decide if they want to ratify or leave the Union. At this point, they can make, so nobody is obliged to stay in the Union if they don't want to, but nobody can block everybody else to go ahead in further integration if the other want to. Because if you want your national sovereignty to be saved, you need to ensure that also national sovereignty of the others is saved. So if you have this double majority is ratified, the other revote within 6 months to decide if they want to ratify or leave. I believe that after Brexit, nobody can be stupid enough to vote for leaving the European Union. And I think that it's time to reform the Union, that there is a strong case to reform the Union to get rid of unanimity. People can understand this. The issue is just if there are leaders that are able, capable, brave enough to tell the truth. We cannot deal with this issue at national level. We need to deal with this issue at European level. And to do that, we need to get rid of unanimity. Otherwise, we're never able to decide. So these are very simple things to say because it's clear to see. And this is true for the military, where we spend 35% with the US with 10% capacity, which means that basically over 2/3 of our military expenditure is useless. So the money we are spending for the defense is useless. 2/3 of it. This is huge. And so there is a huge case for reforming the union. I think that citizens are intelligent enough to make the right choices if they are provided with a good explanation, narrative, and so on. So it's up to the pro-European parties and leaders to make the case for stronger Europe. They have a strong case, a much stronger case than the nationalists. They should just use it and present it properly.
I think that's I'm very glad to hear this, because it is a sort of a defense of democracy, and there is a sort of a knee-jerk reaction that you might see where people sort of say, well, like at the time when democracy is under threat, don't make it even more democratic because it makes it also more majoritarian, which may just kind of give more power to populists. But of course, you're countering that. You're saying, well, let's trust the common sense of people, and let that. So I think it's a finely balanced argument. But I actually, on the final analysis, I think you're absolutely right, and I would kind of go for the same thing. It's just it's one of these things, So when people sort of think, well, is this the right point to do away with unanimity? Where a single sane country could stop a majority of fascist countries from going over the edge. And we're sort of saying, well, okay, let's play this, let's trust it, let's just hope that majority never materializes. So yeah, no, absolutely. But no, going on to the last, you want to come in here?
No, I don't know. I'm wait for a question.
Okay, so going on to the last the last question here, which has to do with, and we have started off there, and you have said a lot of interesting stuff there already, the European defense issue. Sort of given the current political environment and the sort of focus on national interest. I mean, in the previous podcast, when the two of us talked, you made a very interesting point about the 100 billion Germany is setting aside as a sort of an additional investment in addition to the kind of roughly 2% of GDP that it wants to invest as well. Now there are now calls in Germany to triple that, like within the kind of the Christian Democratic Party. The chair of the subcommittee on the defense, he's basically, well, let's triple it to 300 billion. So these numbers that go up, and we're kind of in the middle of a kind of an arms race, really, when you think about it. But the problem, of course, and you made this point very forcefully previously, is if governments, and the German government in particular here, thinks about this as a national issue and invests that 100 billion or maybe 300 billion in a national defense force, when it could really kind of also contribute significantly more to a European infrastructure, then actually it may be counterproductive. But that's what I see happening. I see very, very little. The other thing is Macron came out, and I'm sure you must have heard that as well yesterday, that he would even put boots on the ground, soldiers. That he would not, he would allow that as a possibility. He didn't say he wants to commit to it, but he said, let's not take it off the table. And of course, alarm bells went off across Europe today. So they're saying, "Oh, hang on, we're not going to put, German or or whatever Swedish soldiers, into Ukraine." But this is exactly what Macron alluded to yesterday in Paris. These are, so we have a situation where national players, the president of France, the German government make a very sort of national focused decisions without really kind of coordinating with their partners. And within that environment, we are desperate for a more integration at a defense level. How do you see, especially as this whole thing heats up? I mean, Europe has so far never delivered on the weapons it promised. It simply isn't able to kind of catch up with the demand. So the pressure is building up. And it is also losing credibility. And at the same time, there's increasing demand for some kind of coordinated response. How do you think this is going to play out, and what do you think should happen?
Well, you are absolutely right. The issue is that it's approached at national level. There is no coordination. Everybody say whatever they want, and the result is that we are not able to do what we promise because we are really acting at European level. So what would a European defense look like? we need to address 4 issues. First, what kind of military apparatus we want to have at European level? So what is the military apparatus that we pull together? And what kind of model of defense? We probably have a dual defense. That is a small European capability with a strong coordination of the existing national army, with specialization of these armies and so on, and a centralized level of equipment providing, so that we stop having 10 times. I mean, the US have one kind of tanks, we have 7 tanks. Doesn't make sense in economic terms and so on. They have 3 planes and we have 10 planes and so on and so forth. So this is the reason why our expenditure is so ineffective and unproductive. So if we centralize all these things, everything starts working. And the United States at the beginning, they also had a dual army. They have a very small federal army and strong national militias. And these remained the same until after the Civil War. And the Civil War was possible precisely because the federal army was very small and the national militias were very big. So we'll probably have this kind of model. We need to decide how to finance it and with what kind of governance. The governance, in order to be effective, we need to get rid of unanimity. It needs to be under the control of the Commission, turn into a real federal government, and we can finance it in different ways. We can do like in the monetary union, where we pull together 20% of the reserve of the national banks. We can say, okay, we pull together 20% of the national budget for defense, or we can have a dedicated budget financed by European fiscal policies, or Euro bonds and so on, or we can have a golden rule saying, okay, the money that you take at national level, you put it into the European Defense Fund, the European Peace Facility, and European Joint Industrial Project through the Permanent Structural Cooperation on Defense. These are taken out of the calculation of the Stability and Growth Pact. So this way you are creating an incentive for the member states not to invest on the national defense, but on the European defense. So, or you can have a mixture of all the 3. So there can be different ways to do it. The problem is the political will to do it. And ultimately, the issue is you cannot have a European defense if you don't have a European foreign policy. Because the army, the defense is an instrument of a foreign policy. And to have a foreign policy means that you are represented as such in the main international organization and international arena and so on. So just like the monetary union essentially was the Europeanization of the Deutschmark, the foreign and defense union ultimately are the Europeanization of the French seat at the UN and the French force de frappe. Because you cannot have a European defense with a member state that has a nuclear deterrence that doesn't cover the rest of the union. And you cannot have a European foreign policy if in the main international organization there is France and not Europe. So ultimately the issue is France willing to recognize the fact that alone is unable to play a role on the international arena? That's the issue. The point is, Macron, when Macron said we are maybe should not take off the table that we want to put boots in Ukraine. Okay, but is France the country that has been helping Ukraine more with military equipment? No. And when it was asked why you are not giving more, I mean, Denmark is giving more than France, and they said because we cannot take away our stocks and so on and so forth. So that's the answer. I mean, we have to go for this. And sometimes I'm afraid I really cannot understand. After 2 years of war in Ukraine, what else should happen before we start creating a European defense? I mean, we had Trump saying that he would not defend NATO countries from Russia if they are not putting 2% of their GDP on defense. So what are we waiting to create a European defense? We are like those animals that when there is some threat, they put their head under the sand. And that's nonsense. We need to get real. We have the capacity to deal with the issue. Draghi said this very clearly at the ECOFIN, the meeting of the economic and financial minister. We need 500 billion euro of investment every year for the digital transition, the environmental transition, and defense. Non-member states have the fiscal way to do that. We need to do it at the European level altogether, creating the European single capital market in order to use also private saving to channel this to proper investment in Europe. Because today we have more than 200 billion euros of European saving that go into the US every year. So we would have the financial capacity, but we are not exploiting it because we don't have the single capital market. We don't have a European safe asset like Eurobonds and so on and so forth. So we have the capacity. One of the things that gets me very angry is that when we discuss things, Europeans always feel that they are poor, unable to do anything, and hoping that somebody else will take care of things. We are one of the richest area of the world, in the richest civilization in world history. There was nobody in the history of mankind that had the kind of wealth that we have. In the amount of things each person in Europe possesses, cars, mobile phone, everything, is amazing. There was nobody in the history of mankind that had the kind of wealth we have. The issue is how we decide to use it. It's not that we don't have the resources to do things. We have all the resources we want, provided we decide to use them properly. And if when Putin thinks that we are a decadent society because we spend more for enjoying ourselves, drinking, smoking, drugs, enjoyments, than what we use for investment, education, and research, he has a point, unfortunately. But it's up to us. Our grandparents after the war were very poor and saved a lot in order to give their children a better chance. So they saved a lot and invest a lot to create a better country for their children. We are very rich and we spend everything we have. Now, it's up to us. So there is room for the Europeans to solve their problems. There is chance, provided they act together. Alone, we are small, but united, we are strong. And I would like to close with a famous sentence that is often used against Europe, but it should actually be used in favor of Europe. When people say that Europe is an economic giant, a political dwarf, and a military worm. So this shows that Europe is strong and member states are weak. Because where we have full sovereignty on the economics, Europe is a giant. Where we have kept national sovereignty on foreign and defense policy, we are dwarf or worm. So when this is used against Europe, this should be used against the member states. Because when we pull sovereignty at European level, on those policy area, we are giant. We are the largest trading partner for everybody. We are the largest trading bloc in the world, the largest market, and so on. Where we keep national sovereignty, we are dwarf and worm. So this shows that national sovereignty is the enemy, because the truth is that we have this wrong view of sovereignty. Sovereignty is not national. Sovereignty is of the people. And the people's sovereignty can be exercised at different level of government, at city level, at regional level, at national level, and at European level. You can exercise this sovereignty at different level on the basis of different policy areas. There are policy areas that can be well covered at the communal policy. When you are doing differentiated rubbish, recycling and so on, this can be done at the local level better than European level to decide which days you are going in each area of the city. So for this problem, your people's sovereignty can be better expressed at the city level. But for foreign and security policy in the global world, it doesn't make any sense to have it at national level because it condemns us to be nothing at all on the international arena. We need to move that to the European level. So this is not to say that national level is always useless. There still are a lot of policy areas that can be dealt with the national level. We have different culture, different languages, which means that the educational system, cultural things, this all should be dealt with at national level, not at European level. But there are certain policy areas where the only possible level where this sovereignty can be exercised effectively is the European one. And we should pool sovereignty on those policy areas because otherwise we are done.
Excellent. Roberto, this was a very powerful sort of closing statement here. I'm very grateful for you to be my guest again today. We've slightly overrun, but then we had difficulties in the beginning, so I'm glad we kind of got the full hour. Roberto, thank you ever so much. It's always really, really interesting talking to you. And of course, Europe, and everybody can sense that it's very close to your heart. So it's really, really nice. Every time we talk, I learn an awful lot. So it's almost like my private little university here. So Roberto, thank you ever so much. It's been a great pleasure to have you.
Thank
And
you. Thank you, and I apologize for the problem at the beginning.
No, no problem at all. No problem at all. It's technology. Sometimes it acts up on us. I've had problems myself in the past, so it's great. Thank you ever so much, and let's stay in touch and catch up at some point in the
Sure.
near future.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. Have a good day. Bye bye.